Hello, everyone. Welcome to our first virtual adult story time. We were trying to think of things that we could do as the library for anyone who was stuck at home. So we're going to be trying some story times every Monday at 2 o'clock. I'll be recording them Monday morning and then posting them up Monday afternoon. So if you have any ideas for any stories or poems or anything that you would like to hear, let me know in the comments and I will add those to a list for consideration and maybe read them in advance because I haven't read any of these in advance. So we're going to see how this goes. I'm Sama. I work in the reference department. I'm also the teen librarian. And I do Twitch and other sorts of live streaming. I do video games and audiobooks and all sorts of things on my different channels. So we figured that while I was at home, I could be doing some story times and that sort of thing. Neil Gaiman is wonderful, and he posted that librarians, teachers, etc., could do videos of reading story times of his works. So these will be coming down after this whole thing is over, but for now you'll be able to enjoy these at home. So we're going to get right into it. I've got a short story from Smoke and Mirrors and 2 poems from Fragile Things. So we're going to bookend. We're going to do a poem and the story and then another poem. And we're doing this in one take because I'm used to doing things live. So if I mess up, I'm going to go back a couple of words and try again. So yeah. And we'll see how this all goes. Uncharted territory, all of it, but we will all be there for each other together. So the first poem is called Locks. We owe it to each other to tell stories, as people simply, not as father and daughter. I tell it to you for the 100th time. There was a little girl called Goldilocks, for her hair was long and golden, and she was walking in the wood and she saw cows. You say it with certainty, remembering the straight heifers we saw in the woods behind the house last month. Well, yes, perhaps she saw cows, but she also saw a house. A great big house, you tell me. No, a little house, all painted neat and tidy. A great big house. You have the conviction of all 2-year-olds. I wish I had such certitude. Yes, a great big house. And she went in. I remember as I tell it that the locks of Southie's heroine had silvered with age, the old women and the 3 bears. Perhaps they had been golden once when she was a child. And now we are already up to the porridge. And it was too hot. And it was too cold. And then it was, we chorus, just right. The porridge is eaten, the baby's chair is shattered, Goldilocks goes upstairs, examines beds, and sleeps unwisely. But then the bears return. Remembering Southie still, I do the voices. Father Bear's gruff boom scares you, and you delight in it. When I was a small child and I heard the tale, if I was anyone, I was Baby Bear. My porridge eaten and my chair destroyed and my bed inhabited by some strange girl. You giggle when I do the baby's wail. Someone's been eating my porridge and they've eaten it all up, you say. A response it is, or an amen. The bears go upstairs hesitantly. Their house now feels desecrated. They realize what locks are for. They reach the bedroom. Someone's been sleeping in my bed. And here I hesitate. Echoes of old jokes, soft-core cartoons, crude headlines in my head. One day your mouth will curl at that line, a loss of interest. Later, innocence. Innocence as if it were a commodity. And if I could, my father wrote to me, huge as a bear himself when I was younger, I would dower you with experience, without experience, and I, in my turn, would pass that on to you. But we make our own mistakes. We sleep unwisely. The repetition echoes down the years. When your children grow, when your dark locks begin to silver, when you are an old woman alone with your 3 bears, what will you see? What stories will you tell? And then Goldilocks jumped out of the window and she ran, together now, all the way home. And then you say, again, again, again! We owe it to each other to tell stories. These days, my sympathies with Father Bear. Before I leave my house, I lock the door and check each bed and chair on my return. Again, again, again. All right. So that was short and easy. This one's gonna, oh, sorry, microphone. Sorry, everyone who that might have boomed. This one's gonna be a little bit harder, because short stories that you don't read ahead of time are not the best idea. Past the introduction, it's the first story in this book. So this one is Smoke and Mirrors. It was one of the first Neil Gaiman things I read besides Sandman. Sandman was the first thing I read. Chivalry. Mrs. Whittaker found the Holy Grail. It was under a fur coat. Every Thursday afternoon, Mrs. Whittaker walked down to the post office to collect her pension, even though her legs were no longer what they were. And on the way back home, she would stop in at the Oxfam shop and buy herself a little something. The Oxfam shop sold old clothes, knickknacks, oddments, bits and bobs, and large quantities of old paperbacks. All of them donations. Secondhand flotsam. Often the house clearances of the dead. All of the profits went to charity. The shop was staffed by volunteers. The volunteer on duty this afternoon was Marie, 17, slightly overweight, and dressed in a baggy mauve jumper that looked like she had bought it from the shop. Marie sat by the till with a copy of Modern Woman magazine, filling out a Reveal Your Hidden Personality questionnaire. Every now and then, she'd flip to the back of the magazine and check the relative points assigned to an A, B, or C answer before making up her mind how she'd respond to the question. Mrs. Whittaker puttered around the shop. They still hadn't sold the stuffed cobra, she noted. It had been there for 6 months now, gathering dust, glass eyes gazing balefully at the clothes rack and the cabinet filled with chipped porcelain and chewed toys. Mrs. Whittaker patted its head as she went past. She picked out a couple of Mills and Boom novels from a bookshelf, Her Thundering Soul and Her Turbulent Heart, $1 each, and gave careful consideration to the empty bottle of Matthias Rosé with a decorative lampshade on it before deciding she really didn't have anywhere to put it. She moved a rather threadbare fur coat, which smelled badly of mothballs. Underneath it was a walking stick and a water-stained copy of Romance and Legend of Chivalry by A.R. Hope Moncrief, priced at 5 pence. Next to the book, on its side, was the Holy Grail. It had a little round paper sticker on the base, and written on it in felt pen was the price. 30 pence. Or pounds. I don't know what P stands for. Huh. Mrs. Whittaker picked up the dusty silver goblet and appraised it through her thick spectacles. "This is nice," she called to Marie. Marie shrugged. "It looked nice on the mantelpiece." Marie shrugged again. Mrs. Whittaker gave 50 pence to Marie, who gave her 10 pence change in a brown paper bag to put the books and the Holy Grail in. Then she went next door to the butcher's and bought herself a nice piece of liver. Then she went home. The inside of the goblet was thickly coated with a brownish-red dust. Mrs. Whittaker washed it out with great care, then left it to soak for an hour in warm water with a dash of vinegar added. Then she polished it with metal polish until it gleamed, and she put it on the mantelpiece in her parlor, where it sat between a small, soulful china basset hound and a photograph of her late husband, Henry, on the beach at Frinton in 1953. She had been right. It did look nice. For dinner that evening, she had liver fried and breadcrumbs with onions. It was very nice. The next morning was Friday. On alternate Fridays, Mrs. Whittaker and Mrs. Greenberg would visit each other. Today, it was Mrs. Greenberg's turn to visit Mrs. Whittaker. They sat in the parlor and ate macaroons and drank tea. Mrs. Whittaker took 1 sugar in her tea, but Mrs. Greenberg took sweetener, which she always carried in her handbag in a small plastic container. "That's nice," said Mrs. Greenberg, pointing to the grail. "What is it?" "It's the Holy Grail," said Mrs. Whittaker. "It's the cup that Jesus drank out of at the Last Supper. Later at the crucifixion, it caught his precious blood when the centurion's spear pierced his side." Mrs. Greenberg sniffed. She was small and Jewish and didn't hold with unsanitary things. "I wouldn't know about that," she said, "but it's very nice. Our Myron got one just like that when she won the swimming tournament, only it's got his name on the side." "Is he still with that nice girl, the hairdresser?" "Bernice? Oh yes. They're thinking of getting engaged," said Mrs. Greenberg. "That's nice," said Mrs. Whittaker. She took another macaroon. Mrs. Greenberg baked her own macaroons and brought them over every alternate Friday. Small, sweet, light brown biscuits with almonds on top. They talked about Myron and Bernice and Mrs. Whittaker's nephew Ronald. She had no children. And about their friend Mrs. Perkins, who was in the hospital with her hip. Poor dear. At midday, Mrs. Greenberg went home, and Mrs. Whittaker made herself cheese on toast for lunch. And after lunch, Mrs. Whittaker took her pills, the white and the red and 2 little orange ones. The doorbell rang. Mrs. Whittaker answered the door. It was a young man with shoulder-length hair so fair it was almost white, wearing gleaming silver armor with a white surcoat. "Hello," he said. "Hello," said Mrs. Whittaker. "I'm on a quest," he said. "That's nice," said Mrs. Whittaker noncommittally. "Can I come in?" he asked. Mrs. Whittaker shook her head. "I'm sorry, I don't think so," she said. "I'm on a quest for the Holy Grail," the young man said. "Is it here?" "Have you got any identification?" Mrs. Whittaker asked. She knew that it was unwise to let unidentified strangers into your home when you were elderly and living on your own. Handbags got empty, and worse than that. The young man went back down the garden path. His horse, a huge gray charger, big as a shire horse, its head high and its eyes intelligent, was tethered to Mrs. Whittaker's garden gate. The knight fumbled in the saddlebag and returned with the scroll. It was signed by Arthur, King of all Britons, and charged all persons of whatever rank or station to know that here was Gaiman, Knight of the Round Table, and that he was on a right high and noble quest. There was a drawing of the young man below that. It wasn't a bad likeness. Mrs. Whittaker nodded. She had been expecting a little card with a photograph on it, but this was far more impressive. "I suppose you had better come in," she said. They went to the kitchen. She made Gaiman a cup of tea, then she took him into the parlor. Gaiman saw the grail on the mantelpiece and dropped to one knee. He put down the teacup carefully on the russet carpet. A shaft of light came through the net curtains and painted his odd face with golden sunlight and turned his hair into a silver halo. "It is truly the Sand Grail," he said very quietly. He blinked his pale blue eyes 3 times, very fast, as if he were blinking back tears. He lowered his head as if in silent prayer. Gaiman stood up again and turned to Mrs. Whittaker. "Gracious lady, keeper of the Holy of Holies, let me now depart this place with the blessed chalice, that my journeyings may be ended and my guests fulfilled." "Sorry?" said Mrs. Whittaker. Gaiman walked over to her and took her old hands in his. "My quest is over," he told her. "The Sand Grail is finally within my reach." Mrs. Whittaker pursed her lips. "Can you pick up your teacup and saucer, please?" she said. Gaiman picked up his teacup apologetically. "No, I don't think so," said Mrs. Whittaker. "I rather like it. Right there. It's just right between the dog and the photograph of my Henry." "Is it gold you need? Is it that? Lady, I can bring you gold." "No," said Mrs. Whittaker. "I don't want any gold, thank you. I'm simply not interested." She ushered Gaiman to the front door. "Nice to meet you," she said. His horse was leaning its head over her garden fence, nibbling her gladioli. Several of the neighborhood children were standing on the pavement, watching it. Gaiman took some sugar lumps from the saddlebag and showed the braver of the children how to feed the horse. Their hands held flat. The children giggled. One of the older girls stroked the horse's nose. Gaiman swung himself onto the horse in one fluid movement. Then the horse and the knight trotted off down Hawthorne Crescent. Mrs. Whittaker watched them until they were out of sight, then sighed and went back inside. The weekend was quiet. On Saturday, Mrs. Whittaker took the bus into Maresfield to visit her nephew Ronald, his wife Euphonia, and their daughters Clarissa and Dylan. She took them a currant cake she had baked herself. On Sunday morning, Mrs. Whittaker went to church. Her local church was St. James the Less, which was a little more, don't think of this as a church, think of it as a place where like-minded friends hang out and are joyful, than Mrs. Whittaker felt entirely comfortable with, but she liked the vicar, the Reverend Bartholomew, when he wasn't actually playing the guitar. After the service, she thought about mentioning to him she had the Holy Grail in her front parlor, but decided against it. On Monday morning, Mrs. Whittaker was working in the back garden. She had a small herb garden she was extremely proud of. Dill, vervain, mint, rosemary, thyme, and a wild expanse of parsley. She was down on her knees wearing thick gardening gloves, weeding and picking out slugs and putting them in a plastic bag. Mrs. Whittaker was very tender-hearted when it came to slugs. She would take them down to the back of her garden, which bordered on the railway line, and throw them over the fence. She cut some parsley for the salad. There was a cough behind her. Gaiman stood there, tall and beautiful, his armor glinting in the morning sun. In his arms, he held a long package, wrapped in oiled leather. "I'm back," he said. "Hello," said Mrs. Whittaker. She stood up rather slowly and took off her gardening gloves. "Well," she said, "now that you're here, you might as well make yourself useful." She gave him the plastic bag full of slugs and told him to tip the slugs out over the back of the fence. He did. Then they went into the kitchen. "Tea or lemonade?" she asked. "Whatever you're having," Gilad said. Mrs. Whittaker took a jug of her homemade lemonade from the fridge and sent Gilad outside to pick a sprig of mint. She selected 2 tall glasses. She washed the mint carefully and put a few leaves in each glass, then poured the lemonade. "Is your horse outside?" she asked. "Oh, yes, his name is Grizel." "And you've come a long way, I suppose?" "A very long way." "I see," said Mrs. Whittaker. She took a blue plastic basin from under the sink and half-filled it with water. Gilad took it out to Grizel. He waited while the horse drank and brought the empty basin back to Mrs. Whittaker. "Now," she said, "I suppose you're still after the Grail." "Aye, still do I seek the Sand Grail," he said. He picked up the leather package from the floor, put it down on her tablecloth, and unwrapped it. "For it, I offer this." It was a sword, its blade almost 4 feet long. There were words and symbols traced elegantly along the length of the blade. The hilt was worked in silver and gold, and a large jewel was set in the pommel. "It's very nice," said Mrs. Whittaker doubtfully. "This," said Gilad, "is the sword Balmung, forged by Wayland Smith in the Dawn times. Its twin is Flambert. Who wears it is inconquerable in war, and invincible in battle. Who wears it is incapable of a cowardly act or an ignoble one. Set in its pommel is the sardonyx barcone, which protects its possessor from poison slipped into wine or ale, and from the treachery of friends." Mrs. Whittaker peered at the sword. "It must be very sharp," she said after a little while. "It can slice a falling hair in twain, nay, could slice a sunbeam," said Gilad proudly. "Well then, maybe you ought to put it away," said Mrs. Whittaker. "Don't you want it?" Gilad seemed disappointed. "No, thank you," said Mrs. Whittaker. It occurred to her that her late husband, Henry, would have quite liked it. Would have hung it on the wall in his study next to the stuffed carp he had caught in Scotland, and pointed it out to visitors. Gilad rewrapped the oiled leather around the sword Balmung and tied it up with a white cord. He sat there, disconsolate. Mrs. Whittaker made him some cream cheese and cucumber sandwiches for the journey back and wrapped them in grease-proof paper. She gave him an apple for Grizel. He seemed very pleased with both gifts. She waved them both goodbye. That afternoon, she took the bus down to the hospital to see Mrs. Perkins, who was still in with her hip, poor thing. Mrs. Whittaker took her some homemade fruitcake, although she had left out the walnuts from the recipe, because Mrs. Perkins' teeth weren't what they used to be. She watched a little television that evening and had an early night. On Tuesday, the postman called. Mrs. Whittaker was up in the box room at the top of the house, doing a spot of tidying and taking each step slowly and carefully. She didn't make it downstairs in time. The postman had left her a message which said he tried to deliver a package, but no one was home. Mrs. Whittaker sighed. She put the message into her handbag and went down to the post office. Oh, excuse me. The package was from her niece, Sherelle, in Sydney, Australia. It contained 2 photographs of her husband, Wallace, and her 2 daughters, Dixie and Violet, and a conch shell packed in cotton wool. Mrs. Whittaker had a number of ornamental shells in her bedroom. Her favorite had a view of the Bahamas done on it in enamel. It had been a gift from her sister, Ethel, who had died in 1983. She put the shell and the photographs in her shopping bag. Then, seeing that she was in the area, she stopped in at the Oxfam shop on her way home. "Hello, Mrs. W," said Marie. Mrs. Whittaker stared at her. Marie was wearing lipstick, possibly not the best shade for her, nor particularly expertly applied, but, thought Mrs. Whittaker, that would come with time. And a rather smart skirt. It was a great improvement. "Oh, hello, dear," said Mrs. Whittaker. "There was a man in here last week asking about the thing you bought. That little metal cup thing. I told him where to find you. You don't mind, do you?" "No, dear," said Mrs. Whittaker. "He found me." "He was really dreamy. Really, really dreamy," sighed Marie wistfully. "I could have gone for him." "And he had a big white horse and all," Marie concluded. She was standing up straighter as well, Mrs. Whittaker noted approvingly. On the bookshelf, Mrs. Whittaker found a new Mills and Boon novel, Her Majestic Passion, although she hadn't yet finished the 2 she had bought in her last visit. She picked up the copy of Romance and Legend of Chivalry and opened it. It smelled musty. A Ex Libris Fisher was neatly handwritten at the top of the first page in red ink. She put it down where she had found it. When she got home, Galad was waiting for her. He was giving the neighborhood children rides on Grizel's back up and down the street. "I'm glad you're here," she said. "I've got some cases that need moving." She showed him up to the box room in the top of the house. He moved all the old suitcases for her so she could get to the cupboard at the back. It was very dusty up there. She kept him up there most of the afternoon, moving things around while she dusted. The lad had a cut on his cheek, and he held one arm a little stiffly. They talked while she dusted and tidied. Mrs. Whittaker told him about her late husband, Henry, and how the life insurance had paid the house off, and how she had all these things, but no one really to leave them to. No one but Ronald really, and his wife only liked modern things. She told him how she had met Henry during the war, when he was in the ARP and she hadn't closed the kitchen blackout curtains all the way, and about 6 penny dances they went to in the town, and how they'd gone to London when the war had ended and she'd had her first drink of wine. Galad told Mrs. Whittaker about his mother, Elaine, who was flighty and no better than she should have been, and something of a witch to boot, and his grandfather, King Pillas, who was well-meaning, although at best a little vague, and of his youth in the castle of Bliant on the Joyous Isle, and his father, whom he knew as Le Chevalier Malfait, who was more or less completely mad, and was, in reality, Lancelot du Lac, the greatest of knights in disguise and bereft of his wits, and of Galad's days as a young squire in Camelot. At 5 o'clock, Mrs. Whittaker surveyed the box room and decided that it met with her approval, then opened the windows so it could air, and they went downstairs to the kitchen where she put on the kettle. Galad sat down at the kitchen table. He opened the leather purse at his waist and took out a round white stone. It was about the size of a cricket ball. "My lady," he said, "this is for you, and you give me the Sangreal." Mrs. Whittaker picked up the stone, which was heavier than it looked, and held it up to the light. It was milkily translucent, and deep inside it flecks of silver glittered and glinted in the late afternoon sunlight. It was warm to the touch. Then, as she held it, a strange feeling crept over her. Deep inside, she felt stillness and a sort of peace. Serenity, that was the word for it. She felt serene. Reluctantly, she put the stone back on the table. "It's very nice," she said. "That is the Philosopher's Stone, which our forefather Noah hung in the ark to give light when there was no light. It can transform base materials into gold, and it has certain other properties," the lad told her proudly. "And that isn't all, there's more. Here, look." From the leather bag, he took an egg and handed it to her. It was the size of a goose egg and was a shiny black color, mottled with scarlet and white. When Mrs. Whittaker touched it, the hairs on the back of her neck prickled. Her immediate impression was one of incredible heat and freedom. She heard the crackling of distant fires, and for a fraction of a second she seemed to feel herself far above the world, swooping and diving on the wings of flame. She put the egg down on the table, next to the Philosopher's Stone. "That is the egg of the phoenix," said Galad. "From far Araby it comes. One day it will hatch out into the phoenix bed itself, and when its time comes, the bird will build a nest of flame, lay its egg, and die, to be reborn in flame in a later age of the world." "I thought that's what that was," said Mrs. Whittaker. "And last of all, lady," said Galad, "I have brought you this." He drew from his pouch and gave to her an apple, apparently carved from a single ruby on an amber stem. A little nervously, she picked it up. It was soft to the touch, deceptively so. Her fingers bruised it, and ruby-colored juice from the apple ran down Mrs. Whittaker's hand. The kitchen filled, almost imperceptibly, magically, with the smell of summer fruit, of raspberries and peaches and strawberries and red currants. As if from a great way away, she heard distant voices raised in song and far music on the air. "It is one of the apples of the Hesperides," said Galad quietly. "One bite from it will heal any illness or wound, no matter how deep. A second bite restores youth and beauty. A third bite is said to grant eternal life." Mrs. Whittaker licked the sticky juice from her hand. It tasted like a fine wine. There was a moment then when it all came back to her, how it would be to be young, to have a firm, slim body that would do whatever she wanted it to run down a country lane for the simple, unladylike joy of running, to have men smile at her just because she was herself and happy about it. Mrs. Whittaker looked at Sir Galad, most comely of all knights, sitting fair and noble in her small kitchen. She caught her breath. And that's all I have brought for you, said Galad. They weren't easy to get either. Mrs. Whittaker put the ruby fruit down on our kitchen table. My cats are pouncing around. She looked at the Philosopher's Stone and the Egg of the Phoenix and the Apple of Life. Then she walked into her parlor and looked at the mantelpiece, at the little china basset hound and the Holy Grail and the photograph of her late husband, Henry, shirtless, smiling, and eating an ice cream in black and white, almost 40 years away. She went back into the kitchen. The kettle had begun to whistle. She poured a little steaming water into the teapot, swirled it around, and poured it out. Then she added 2 spoonfuls of tea and 1 for the pot, and poured in the rest of the water. All this she did in silence. She turned to Galad then, and she looked at him. Put that apple away, she told Galad firmly. You shouldn't offer things like that to old ladies. It isn't proper. She paused then. But I'll take the other 2, she continued after a moment's thought. They'll look nice on the mantelpiece. And 2 for 1's fair, or I don't know what is. Galad beamed. He put the ruby apple into his leather pouch. Then he went down on one knee and kissed Mrs. Whittaker's hand. Stop that, said Mrs. Whittaker. She poured them both cups of tea after getting out the very best china, which was only for special occasions. They sat in silence, drinking their tea. When they had finished their tea, they went into the parlor. Galad crossed himself and picked up the Grail. Mrs. Whittaker arranged the egg in the stone where the Grail had been. The egg kept tipping on one side, and she propped it up against the little china dog. They do look very nice, said Mrs. Whittaker. Yes, agreed Galad. They look very nice. Can I give you anything to eat before you go back? She asked. He shook his head. Some fruitcake, she said. You may not think you want any now, but you'll be glad of it in a few hours then. In a few hours' time. And you should probably use the facilities. Now give me that, I'll wrap it up for you. She directed him to the small toilet at the end of the hall and went into the kitchen, holding the Grail. She had some old Christmas wrapping paper in the pantry, and she wrapped the Grail in it and tied the package with twine. Then she cut a large slice of fruitcake and put it in a brown paper bag, along with a banana and a slice of processed cheese and silver foil. The lad came back from the toilet. She gave him the paper bag and the Holy Grail. Then she went up on tiptoes and kissed him on the cheek. You're a nice boy, she said. You take care of yourself. He hugged her and she shooed him out of the kitchen and out at the back door, and she shut the door behind him. She poured herself another cup of tea and cried quietly into a Kleenex while the sound of hoofbeats echoed down Hawthorne Crescent. On Wednesday, Mrs. Whittaker stayed in all day. On Thursday, she went down to the post office to collect her pension. Then she stopped in at the Oxfam shop. The woman on the till was new to her. Where's Marie? Asked Mrs. Whittaker. The woman on the till, who had blue-rinsed gray hair and blue spectacles that went up into diamond points, shook her head and shrugged her shoulders. She went off with a young man, she said, on a horse. I ask you, I meant to be down in the Hearthfield shop this afternoon. I had to get my Johnny to run me up here while we find someone else. Oh, said Mrs. Whittaker. Well, it's nice that she found herself a young man. Nice for her, maybe, said the lady on the till. But some of us were meant to be in Heathfield this afternoon. On a shelf near the back of the shop, Mrs. Whittaker found a tarnished old silver container with a long spout. It had been priced at 60 pence, according to the little paper label stuck to the side. It looked like a flattened, elongated teapot. She picked out a Mills and Boon novel she hadn't read before. It was called Her Singular Love. She took the book and the silver container up to the woman on the till. 65p, dear, said the woman, picking up the silver object, staring at it. Funny old thing, isn't it? Came in this morning. It had writing carved along the side in blocky old Chinese characters and an elegant arcing handle. Some kind of oil can, I suppose. No, it's not an oil can, said Mrs. Whittaker, who knew exactly what it was. It's a lamp. There was a small metal finger ring, unornamented, tied to the handle of the lamp with brown twine. Actually, said Mrs. Whittaker, on second thoughts, I think I'll just have the book. She paid her 5 pence for the novel and put the lamp back where she had found it and in the back of the shop. After all, Mrs. Whittaker reflected as she walked home, it wasn't as if she had anywhere to put it. That was Chivalry. That was our short story for today. I'm going to finish up with one of my favorite poems. I haven't actually read it in a long time, but it's a really good one. It's called Instructions. And you can find some illustrated versions of it online, and it's really pretty, and I love it. Touch the wooden gate in the wall you never saw before. Say please before you open the latch. Go through, walk down the path. A red metal imp hangs from the green painted front door as a knocker. Do not touch it, it will bite your fingers. Walk through the house. Take nothing, eat nothing. However, if any creature tells you that it hungers, feed it. If it tells you that it is dirty, clean it. If it cries to you that it hurts, if you can, ease its pain. From the back of the garden you will be able to see the wildwood. The deep well you walk past leads down to Winter's realm. There's another land at the bottom of it. If you turn around here, you can walk back safely. You will lose no face, I will think no less of you. Once through the garden you will be in the wood. The trees are old. Eyes peer from the undergrowth. Beneath a twisted oak sits an old woman. She may ask for something. Give it to her. She will point the way to the castle. Inside are 3 princesses. Do not trust the youngest. Walk on. In the clearing beyond the castle, the 12 months sit about a fire, warming their feet, exchanging tales. They may do favors for you, if you are polite. You may pick strawberries in December's frost. Trust the wolves, but do not tell them where you are going. The river can be crossed by the ferry. The ferryman will take you. The answer to his question is this. If he hands the oar to his passenger, he will be free to leave the boat. Only tell him this from a safe distance. If an eagle gives you a feather, keep it safe. Remember that giants sleep too soundly, that witches are often betrayed by their appetites. Dragons have one soft spot somewhere, always. Hearts can be well hidden, and you betray them with your tongue. Do not be jealous of your sister. Know that diamonds and roses are as uncomfortable when they tumble from one's lips as toads and frogs. Colder, too, and sharper, and they can cut. Remember your name. Do not lose hope. What you seek will be found. Trust ghosts. Trust those you have helped to help you in return. Trust dreams. Trust your heart and trust your story. When you come back, return the way you came. Favors will be returned, debts be repaid. Do not forget your manners. Do not look back. Ride the wise eagle, you shall not fall. Ride the silver fish, you will not drown. Ride the gray wolf, hold tightly to his fur. There is a worm at the heart of the tower, that is why it will not stand. When you reach the little house, the place your journey started, you will recognize it, although it will seem much smaller than you remember. Walk up the path and through the garden gate you never saw before but once, and then go home, or make a home, or rest. So those are our story times for today. I hope you enjoyed. We will be hopefully doing some more things on our Facebook, on YouTube, that sort of thing as time goes on. We'll be trying to figure out some other things to put up. So if you have any ideas, again, please leave them in the comments. So if you have ideas for videos we can put up, anything we can share on our Facebook page that would be helpful, anything we can share on our Twitter or Instagram that would be helpful, or any other stories that you would like me to take a look at and read ahead of time so I don't mispronounce things like I probably did a lot of today. Just again, please let us know. We will be here for you as much as we can. A lot of us have access to the Facebook and to our emails. You can email the library anytime. We will get back to you as soon as we can. Stay safe, everyone, and we will see you next time. Bye.